Have you ever been erased so completely that your own family forgot you existed? The judge's voice shattered the air like a stone through glass. Remove her from this courtroom immediately. The bailiff turned, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor, and began walking toward me with the grim purpose of a man following orders he did not question. Across the room, my father sat at the plaintiff's table and smiled. It was not a nervous smile. It was not a reluctant smile. It was the deep, satisfied, almost radiant smile of a man who had spent 40 years trying to break something and believed he had finally, in that precise moment, succeeded. In the span of a single heartbeat, the entire room believed I was nothing but a disruption to be physically discarded. So I did not stand. I did not shout. I simply looked past the advancing bailiff, fixed my eyes on the judge, and whispered 3 very quiet words. All color drained from his face in an instant. His hands began to shake so violently that he dropped his gavel onto the floor with a crack that echoed through the stunned silence. And the world that had been so certain just seconds before collapsed into a terrified, breathless void. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told that your voice does not matter, smash that like button right now and subscribe with all notifications turned on. You are about to witness a story that proves the quietest people often carry the most devastating power. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that being invisible does not mean being weak. It means you are simply waiting for the right moment to be seen. My name is Elena Brooks. I was 62 years old on that bitter February morning, standing in the county courthouse of Ashford, Montana, watching my father's carefully constructed empire of pride and control begin to collapse one syllable at a time. To understand how I arrived at that moment, you have to go back. Not just weeks or months, but decades. You have to understand the kind of man William Brooks was, the kind of childhood I survived, and the kind of secret life I built in the vast, silent spaces where my family never thought to look. William Brooks was not simply a rancher. He was the rancher. The Brooks Ranch sprawled across 28,000 acres of prime Montana grassland, running from the foothills of the Absaroka Range all the way down to the winding silver ribbon of the Yellowstone River. My great-grandfather had homesteaded the original claim in 1887, and every generation since had added to it, fought for it, bled for it, and wrapped their entire identity around it. My father took that inheritance and transformed it into a personal kingdom. By the time I was born, he was the largest private landholder in 3 counties. He sat on the boards of banks, hospitals, and the State Cattlemen's Association. Governors called him for advice. Senators sent him Christmas cards. The local paper quoted him so frequently that one summer my brother and I made a game of counting his name in each edition. To the outside world, William Brooks was a towering figure of integrity and strength. He had a handshake that people described as better than a signed contract. He sponsored Little League teams, donated to the church, and personally paid for the town's 4th of July fireworks every year. Old men in the diner would say, "If Bill Brooks says it's so, it's so." Young men aspired to be him. Women admired his old-fashioned courtesy. He was, by every external measure, a great man. Inside our house, however, the architecture of affection was different. My father had very clear, very rigid ideas about what a child should be. A child should be useful. A child should reflect well on the family name. A child should understand that the ranch came first, always, and that personal desires were indulgences to be suppressed. My younger brother, Marcus, fit this mold perfectly. He was born robust and fearless, with a natural affinity for horses and cattle and the hard, physical labor that defined ranch life. By the time he was 6, he could ride a pony bareback. By 10, he could rope a calf. By 14, he could work a full day alongside the hired hands and then sit at the dinner table discussing herd management with a seriousness that made my father beam. Photographs of Marcus covered the mantel. Stories of Marcus filled every gathering. "My boy Marcus," my father would say, and his voice would swell with an unmistakable pride. Then there was me. I was born first, 3 years before Marcus, and from the very beginning I was a disappointment. Not because I was defective, but because I was different. I was quiet where my father wanted loud. I was curious where he wanted obedient. I asked questions about the stars, the soil, the way rivers carved canyons, the languages people spoke in countries I would only ever see on maps. I read books in the hayloft when I was supposed to be learning to cook. I won the S. Chul spelling bee 4 years in a row. I solved algebra problems 2 grade levels above my own. My teachers sent home notes praising my exceptional intellectual gifts. My father would glance at those notes and set them aside without comment. Once I overheard him tell a neighbor, "Elena's got her head in the clouds. Book learning doesn't run a ranch." The neighbor chuckled. I was 9 years old, and I understood perfectly. My value in my father's eyes was approximately 0. My mother, Clara, was the only person who made my childhood bearable. She was a gentle woman with a spine of absolute steel, born in New England to a family of academics, transplanted to Montana by love and stubbornness. She never openly defied my father. That was not the way of their generation or their community, but she built an entire parallel universe of support for me. She bought me books with money she saved from the household budget. She drove me to science fairs in other towns. She sat with me at the kitchen table late at night, helping me memorize French vocabularies and chemical formulas. She would brush my hair and say, "You are going to do extraordinary things, Elena. Your mind is a gift. Do not let anyone, not even your father, convince you otherwise." She was my witness, my champion, the single person who saw me clearly and loved me completely. When she died 16 years ago, of a cancer that moved too fast for any treatment to catch, I lost not just a mother, but the only mirror that ever reflected my true self. My father mourned her with dignified brevity. Within 6 months, her photographs were replaced with newer pictures of Marcus and his growing family. Within a year, it was as though she had never existed. I left Ashford at 18 on a full academic scholarship to a university in Massachusetts. My father drove me to the bus station in Billings. The ride took 2 hours, and he did not speak a single word the entire way. At the station, he handed me $50 and said, "Don't embarrass the family." That was his goodbye. I stood on the platform watching his truck disappear down the highway, and I felt something inside me close like a door. I was not sad. I was resolved. I would build a life so far beyond the narrow expectations of Ashford, Montana, that my father's dismissal would become irrelevant. I would become someone. I just did not yet know what that meant. College was a revelation. I discovered geology, cartography, satellite imagery analysis, linguistics, and the quiet, obsessive joy of finding patterns in apparently random data. I double-majored in Earth systems science and Russian, a combination that baffled my advisors but made perfect sense to me. The Earth and its languages both contained hidden structures, and I wanted to learn how to read them. I graduated with highest honors. A Navy recruiter approached me at a career fair, a sharp-eyed woman who asked unusual questions about my puzzle-solving abilities and my comfort with ambiguity. She mentioned intelligence work. I signed up before I left the gymnasium. The Navy trained me. Then, after my first tour, a different organization recruited me. It is difficult to describe this organization without using words that do not belong in public conversation. It was not the CIA, not the NSA, not any of the agencies whose acronyms appear in newspapers. It was smaller, quieter, and vastly more discreet. Its existence was known to only a handful of congressional overseers and the very highest echelons of the defense establishment. Its work involved threat identification, pattern disruption, and what the analysts called quiet interdiction. The umbrella designation for the constellation of operations I eventually helped coordinate was the Evening Star Protocol. The name was chosen, I was told, because the evening star appears when the world is half-lit and most people are looking the other way. That was the protocol's purpose: to operate in the spaces where attention did not fall, to resolve problems before they became headlines, to protect lives without anyone ever knowing protection had been necessary. I cannot tell you the details of my work. I will not. The non-disclosure agreements I signed are binding for life, and the secrets I carry are not mine to share. But I can tell you this. For 29 years, I served in places most maps do not acknowledge. I learned languages that appear on no census. I analyzed satellite photographs the way other people read novels. I built networks of sources who risked their lives to pass information. I sat in windowless rooms for 16-hour stretches, piecing together fragments that, correctly assembled, prevented catastrophes. I missed Christmases, birthdays, funerals, and every ordinary marker of a normal life. I gave up the possibility of marriage, children, and the steady accumulation of friends and neighbors that defines most people's existence. In exchange, I received the knowledge that my work mattered. It mattered enormously, and I received something else: the slow, hard-won certainty that I was not, and never had been, invisible. I was simply unseen by the people who had chosen not to look. During those decades, I returned to Montana only a handful of times. Each visit was painful. The ranch was beautiful, achingly beautiful, and walking its land felt like stepping back into a past I had tried to bury. My father treated my visits as interruptions. He would ask how long I was staying before he asked how I was. He would find excuses to leave the room when I spoke. He never once asked what I did for a living. Not once in 29 years. Marcus, busy with his own family and the endless demands of ranch management, was warm but distant. He had absorbed our father's worldview without ever consciously choosing it. He assumed I had moved away and built some vague, unimportant life on the East Coast. He never thought to question that assumption, and I never forced the issue. The silence between us was not hostile. It was simply empty. My mother's health began to fail in her late 60s. I flew back when I could, which was not often enough. The assignments I was on did not permit casual absences. I saw her 3 times in her final 2 years. Each time she was thinner, quieter, but her eyes still held that fierce, unwavering light. She held my hand and asked, "Are you happy?" I told her I was useful. She smiled a little sadly and said, "Useful is good, but happy is better. Promise me you'll look for happy." I promised. She died in early autumn when the cottonwoods were just beginning to turn gold. I was on assignment in a place I cannot name, and by the time I received the message, she had already been buried. My father did not call me. Marcus sent a brief email that read, "Mom passed peacefully. Service was yesterday. Dad handled everything. Take care." I sat in a secure office 6,000 miles away and wept until I could not breathe. Then I wiped my face, stood up, and went back to work. That was what I had been trained to do. That was what the Evening Star Protocol demanded. Compartmentalize, function, protect. But a small, vital piece of my heart calcified that day into something hard and permanent. I had missed my mother's death because I was serving something larger than myself, and the family I was serving had not even thought to wait for me. When my mother's will was read, the bombshell detonated. Elena Brooks, the quiet wife who had spent 4 decades planting lilacs and reading poetry, had secretly, methodically, with the help of a sharp attorney in Helena, restructured her estate. She left a 45% ownership stake in the Brooks Ranch to me, not to Marcus, not to William, to me. The will included a handwritten letter, composed on her personal stationery, the ink slightly smudged in places as though she had been crying while writing it. It read, "To my Elena, my dearest heart, you have always belonged to this land, even when the land did not know it. Your father may never understand you, but I understand you perfectly, and I love you beyond measure. This is my final promise that you will never be invisible. Tend this place with the same care you bring to everything you touch. Do not let anyone take what is yours. I will be watching. Mammon." The attorney read the letter aloud in a conference room thick with tension. My father's face turned the color of raw meat. He slammed his fist on the mahogany table and shouted that the will was fraudulent, that my mother had been confused by medication, that no court would uphold such a clear violation of his expectations. He contested it. He hired expensive lawyers. He fought for 2 full years, and he lost. Every court, every judge, every appeal confirmed that Elena Brooks had the absolute right to distribute her property as she saw fit, and that her decision was legally unassailable. My 45% was mine. So my father did what he had always done. He ignored it. He continued managing the entire ranch as his sole domain. He never sent me annual reports. He never consulted me on decisions. He never acknowledged my legal stake. And I, still deep in my classified work, still living a life of temporary apartments and long flights and secrets that could never be shared, did not press the issue. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I did not need that piece of Montana. I was wrong. My mother's gift was not about land. It was about belonging, and I had not yet learned how to claim it. Then, 5 years after my retirement from active service, the certified letter arrived. I was 62 years old, living in a small townhouse in Norfolk, Virginia, spending my days consulting occasionally, walking near the water, reading voraciously, and trying to remember how to live a life that was not defined by constant vigilance. The letter was from a law firm in Billings I did not recognize. It informed me that William Brooks was suing me for a endowment and seeking to revoke my ownership rights. The complaint alleged that I had never contributed to the maintenance of the ranch, that I had shown no interest in its operations, and that my continued stake represented a threat to the property's long-term viability. The language was cold, precise, and devastatingly effective. It painted me as a ghost, a dead branch on the family tree, an obstacle to be surgically removed. I read the letter 4 times, standing at my kitchen counter, a mug of coffee cooling beside my hand. Then I called the only person I could think of who might help. Her name was Dr. Amara Osai, a former colleague from my Evening Star years who had left intelligence work to become a civil litigator. Amara was brilliant, fierce, and owed me a debt from a long-ago operation that had nearly ended very badly. She answered on the second ring. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, a quality I have always valued. Then she said, "Elena, that man is not suing over land. He is suing to erase the last trace of your mother's will. He wants to prove that you do not exist in any meaningful sense. We are going to make absolutely certain he fails. I will represent you. Clear your schedule." I did. We flew to Montana together in early February. The flight was long and bumpy, the winter air full of turbulence. Amara reviewed documents on her laptop while I stared out the window at the frozen patchwork of fields below. Memories I had intentionally buried for decades began surfacing like bubbles from deep, cold water. The time my father gave Marcus a colt for his 10th birthday while I received a book on accounting. The time he introduced me to a visiting rancher as the one who reads too much. The time he told my mother, within my earshot, that I would probably end up an old maid with too many cats. The time I won a National Geography award and he asked if there was any prize money attached. The 1,000 small dismissals, each one a tiny chisel strike against my sense of worth, each one a brick in the wall of indifference he had built around me. And yet, I had survived. More than survived. I had built a career of profound, unrecognized significance. I had protected people who would never know my name. I had been trusted with responsibilities that would crush most people, and my father had no idea. That, I realized somewhere over Iowa, was the central tragedy. He never asked, he never wanted to know, and now he was trying to legally confirm that I did not exist. Ashford, Montana, was exactly as I remembered it. The main street still had the same hardware store with its faded sign, the same diner with cracked vinyl booths, the same stone courthouse with its clock tower that had been stuck at 3:17 for as long as anyone could recall. The winter air sliced through clothing. The mountains stood in the distance like ancient, indifferent witnesses. Amara and I checked into a small bed and breakfast run by a woman named Helen Whitfield, who had known my mother through church circles. Helen looked at me with the kind of soft, knowing sadness that only old family acquaintances can summon. She said, "Your mother was the finest woman I ever knew. She talked about you constantly, Elena. Every Sunday, every coffee hour, she would update us on your achievements. She was so immensely proud. She said you were doing important work, even if she couldn't explain what it was." I thanked her and retreated to my room, where I sat by the window and watched the snow begin to fall in slow, heavy flakes. That night, I barely slept. The past was too loud. The next morning, we entered the courthouse. The building was a grand old structure of dark stone and white columns, built in 1903 and renovated several times since. Inside, the floors were polished wood, the ceilings were high, and the air smelled of old paper and floor wax. The courtroom itself was smaller than I had expected, all dark paneling and rows of wooden benches. The spectators section was already half full. My father was there, seated at the plaintiff's table with an attorney I had never seen, a silver-haired man in an expensive charcoal suit who radiated the particular confidence of someone who bills by the hour and never loses sleep. My father looked older, much older than I remembered. His hair had gone completely white. His broad shoulders had narrowed, but his eyes still held that familiar gleam of iron certainty. When I walked in, he glanced at me, and I saw a flicker of something, anger, yes, but also surprise. He had not expected me to show up. He had assumed I would fold, as I had always appeared to fold, and allow him to claim his victory by default. My presence was a disruption to his carefully laid plans. Marcus sat in the second row. He looked tired and uncomfortable, his body angled away from our father, his hands clasped between his knees. When our eyes met, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a greeting of warmth, it was a signal of recognition, an acknowledgement that we were both trapped in a drama neither of us had chosen. I nodded back. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache, called the court to order. Judge Harold Hanford entered. Judge Hanford was a large man with a florid complexion and the self-assured manner of someone who had never been meaningfully contradicted. He settled onto the bench and surveyed the room with a proprietary gaze. Before proceedings began, he leaned down and exchanged quiet words with my father's attorney. They smiled. They laughed softly about something I could not hear. A cold, familiar certainty settled in my stomach. This was not a neutral arbiter. This was a friend of my father's. The fix was already in. The first 2 hours were procedural. Amara argued motions to dismiss based on the will's clarity and the prior court rulings that had already upheld it. The judge denied every motion. She attempted to introduce financial records documenting my contributions to the ranch over the years, payments I had made quietly through intermediaries to cover property taxes, emergency veterinary services, irrigation repairs, and my mother's medical expenses. The judge refused to admit them. He called them irrelevant. He called them an attempt to distract from the core issue. When Amara objected, he overruled her with a dismissive wave. When she pressed, he threatened to sanction her for repeated disregard of the court's rulings. The pattern was unmistakable. The hearing was not a legal proceeding. It was a ritual. The outcome had already been decided. By early afternoon, the tension in the room was suffocating. The judge had ruled against every significant motion we filed. He had repeatedly cut Amara off mid-sentence. He had even suggested, in a patronizing tone, that she might benefit from reviewing local court procedure before attempting to practice in this jurisdiction. The spectators, a collection of local ranchers, retired farmers, and curious townspeople, were murmuring. My father looked increasingly relaxed. At one point, he leaned over and said something to Marcus, who responded with a tight, unhappy smile. I saw my father check his watch, then smile again, as if he were already calculating when he could be home for dinner. Then the judge did something that crossed a final, invisible boundary. Amara had attempted once more to introduce the financial records, this time with a formal offer of proof citing specific legal precedents. The judge's face reddened so deeply, it looked almost purple. He banged his gavel with such force that the sound ricocheted off the back wall. He accused me of withholding information. He accused Amara of deliberately obstructing the proceedings. His voice rose to a near shout. Then he turned to the bailiff and gave the order. Drag her out, remove the defendant from my courtroom. The words seemed to hang in the air for an impossibly long moment. The bailiff hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, a tiny break in his professional composure, and then began walking toward me. His face was blank, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that might have been reluctance or even shame. Across the room, my father smiled. It was not a nervous smile. It was not a tentative smile. It was a deep, slow, triumphant smile, the smile of a man watching his greatest, oldest enemy finally, publicly, completely destroyed. It was the smile of someone who had spent 40 years trying to break something and believed, in that precise moment, that he had succeeded. I saw it, and instead of feeling afraid, I felt a profound, almost supernatural calm settle over me. I had been in rooms with armed men. I had been in situations where a single wrong word could trigger catastrophic outcomes. I had faced threats that would make a bailiff look like a paper doll. This courtroom, this judge, this petty display of corrupted authority, they were small things. Small, sad things. And I was suddenly, fiercely tired of being treated as something to be dragged. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply turned my head slowly, looked past the approaching bailiff, and met Judge Hanford's eyes directly. My voice was quiet, calm, almost conversational. Are you familiar with the Evening Star Protocol? The change was not gradual. It was instantaneous and absolute. The judge's florid complexion drained to a ghastly, bloodless white so quickly it was as though someone had pulled a plug beneath his skin. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He gripped the edge of his bench with both hands, his knuckles turning the color of old ivory. His gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor with a sharp crack that seemed to echo for an eternity. He stared at me as if I had just materialized out of the empty air, a ghost from a past he had spent decades trying to forget. The bailiff stopped walking. He turned to look at the judge. His expression bewildered. The court reporter's hands hovered motionless above her machine. In the back row, a man I had noticed earlier, a quiet man in a dark suit who had been taking notes with unusual intensity, suddenly became very still, his pen frozen mid-word. My father's smile fractured like thin ice under sudden pressure. He looked at the judge, then at me, then back at the judge, and I saw fear enter his eyes for the very first time in my life. Real, raw, unmasked fear. It was the most honest expression I had ever seen on his face. The judge finally made a sound. It was somewhere between a gasp and a strangled choke. He raised a trembling hand and said, "Clear the courtroom, everyone out, now." No one moved immediately. The spectators were frozen, confused. I said now? This time his voice cracked on the final word, and the sound of it, the sound of a powerful man coming unglued, broke the spell. People began standing, gathering coats, shuffling toward the door in a confused murmur. My father's attorney tried to object. The judge cut him off with a gesture that looked almost desperate, almost pleading. Within 2 minutes, the room was nearly empty. The bailiff remained by the door, looking uncertain. Amara remained beside me, her hand on my arm. The court reporter stayed, her face pale. And the man in the dark suit did not move. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, a human sphinx in the back row. Judge Hanford leaned forward so far I thought he might topple off the bench. His voice was barely more than a ragged whisper. "How do you know that designation?" He pronounced the word designation with the careful, almost reverent precision of someone who understands its full weight. Not name, not phrase, designation. That single word confirmed everything I needed to know. Judge Hanford had not spent his entire career on the bench. Before becoming a judge, he had been a junior attorney in the Department of Justice, assigned to an oversight unit that reviewed highly classified intelligence operations. He had been briefed on Evening Star. He had signed non-disclosure agreements that were still binding. He knew, in the marrow of his bones, what that designation signified. And he knew that anyone who could speak it aloud, in a public courtroom, with calm certainty, was not someone to be dragged anywhere by anyone. I did not answer his question immediately. I let the silence stretch. One of the first things I learned in intelligence work is that silence is not empty. It is a container. If you hold it long enough, the other person will fill it with their own fears. Finally, I said very quietly, "I think you already know the answer, Judge Hanford." He stared at me. Recognition was dawning in his eyes like a slow, terrible sunrise. He was assembling the pieces. My name, my background, the gaps in my employment history that looked like nothing but were actually reinforced doors, my composure under pressure, the designation I had spoken. He realized, perhaps for the first time since ascending to the bench, that he was not dealing with a reclusive, disappointing daughter. He was dealing with a veteran of a world he had only glimpsed from a legal advisory distance, a world where power was measured not in acres or cattle, but in secrets and silence. And he had just tried to have her physically expelled from his courtroom like a piece of trash. If you're feeling the sheer weight of this moment, if your heart is pounding even slightly, do me a quick favor. Pause right now. Click the subscribe button and turn on all notifications. This story is not just about a courtroom revelation. It is about what happens when a lifetime of silent strength finally chooses its moment to speak. And share this video with someone who needs to remember that the most underestimated people in any room are often carrying the most devastating secrets. Let's continue deeper. The judge recessed the hearing immediately. He practically fled the bench, retreating to his chambers with an unsteady gait. Amara and I stepped into the hallway, which was already buzzing with confused, excited speculation. My father was leaning against a wall near the restrooms, his face still pale, his attorney speaking to him in urgent, hushed tones. Marcus stood a few feet away, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like wonder. When he caught my eye, he mouthed a single word. "How?" I shook my head slightly. "Not here, not now." We gathered our documents and walked out of the courthouse into the biting February air. A small crowd had gathered on the steps, drawn by the sudden commotion. I ignored them. Amara drove us back to Helen's bed and breakfast through streets that were already filling with the day's first snow. The mountains had disappeared behind a curtain of white. Amara was silent for several miles. Then she said, "Elena, I have known you for 18 years. You have never once mentioned Evening Star. What in God's name just happened?" I kept my eyes on the road. A corrupt judge with a guilty conscience just realized he picked the wrong defendant. And my father just learned that the daughter he spent 40 years ignoring was not actually ignorable. That night, I sat alone in my room at Helen's. The window overlooked a small garden now buried under a foot of snow. I thought about my mother. I thought about the lilacs she used to plant along the porch, the the way their scent would drift through the open windows in early summer. I thought about the afternoon, 8 months before she died, when she had looked at me with her tired, luminous eyes and said, "You are so much stronger than this family has ever acknowledged, Elena. One day, you will have to show them." I only wish I could be there to see it. At the time, I had assumed she was speaking metaphorically. Now I understood. She had known about the lawsuit before it ever materialized. She had probably overheard my father's plans, his mutterings about fixing the inheritance problem once and for all. And she had quietly, preemptively, set her own countermeasure in motion. The will, the letter, the 45%, they were not just gifts. They were her final, defiant act of love. They were the weapon she had placed in my hands, trusting that I would know how to use it when the moment arrived. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever been made to feel invisible by someone who was supposed to see you? Drop a single candle emoji in the comments. Let's create a light of recognition right here in this community. And if you have not yet subscribed, take a second right now to do so. Every subscription tells me you want more stories about people who discover their own hidden strength. Now, let's step into the days of chaos that followed. By the next morning, word had spread across Ashford County faster than any telephone tree could manage. The diner was full by 7 o'clock, every booth occupied by people trading theories over eggs and coffee. The feed store buzzed, the post office buzzed, the barber shop buzzed. Everyone had a different idea about what I had said to make Judge Hanford turn white. Some people thought I was a former CIA operative who had gone deep undercover. Others speculated I had been a key witness in a federal organized crime case, or a Pentagon analyst with knowledge of buried scandals, or a retired federal marshal who knew where bodies were hidden. One particularly creative theory, advanced by an old farmer named Gus who had known my grandfather, held that I had been part of a secret military unit stationed in the Arctic Circle. None of the theories were correct, but the sheer variety and intensity of them spoke to a deeper truth. People were no longer seeing me as the quiet, disappointing daughter who had abandoned the ranch. They were seeing me as a mystery. And mysteries, unlike disappointments, command attention and respect. My father, isolated in his big ranch house at the end of the gravel road, reacted exactly as I expected. He called his attorney 4 times that day, according to information I later received from Marcus. He demanded to know what Evening Star protocol meant. His attorney, a competent but ultimately mortal man with no security clearances, had no access to classified archives. He called contacts. He called former colleagues. He called a retired federal judge in Denver, a former prosecutor in Seattle, a law school classmate who now worked in Washington. Every inquiry returned the same answer: nothing. The protocol did not exist in any publicly accessible database. There were no media references, no academic citations, no Freedom of Information Act documents, no whispers in any professional network. It was a ghost, an absolute, impenetrable ghost. And the ghost, as far as Charles Delacroix was concerned, had just spoken his name in open court and made a federal judge tremble. On the second day after the recusal, a new and interesting development arrived. Amara received a phone call from a lawyer named Everett Cho, a sharply dressed, soft-spoken man in his early 50s who said he was based in Washington, D.C. He explained that he had been asked to observe the remaining proceedings. He was not representing any party. He was not filing any motions. He was simply there, he said, to ensure that all relevant protocols, he paused on that word with what I imagined was a very slight smile, are properly respected. Amara told me about the call while we were eating breakfast at the diner. I nodded and sipped my coffee. The presence of a Washington observer confirmed my quiet suspicion. My mention of Evening Star had triggered soft alarms inside the intelligence community. Someone with authority, someone in a position to act quickly, wanted to make sure the situation did not escalate in any direction that might compromise classified information. Someone wanted to protect not just the protocol's secrets, but perhaps me as well. The family I had served in silence for so long was now, in its own quiet way, serving me. That afternoon, Marcus came to see me. He arrived at Helen's bed and breakfast looking exhausted, unshaven, and years older than he had appeared in the courtroom. He asked if we could talk privately. We walked to a small park near the courthouse, the same park where my mother used to take us to feed the ducks when we were children. The frozen fountain stood at its center, a bronze sculpture of a jumping trout rendered dark against the snow. Marcus sat on a bench and rubbed his hands together against the cold. He did not look at me at first. He stared at the frozen fountain as if it held answers. "Dad hired a private investigator 3 days ago," he said eventually. "Some guy from Denver who specializes in deep background checks. Former FBI, supposed to be one of the best. He spent 18 hours trying to find anything about your military record, your employment history, your finances, your associates. And then this morning, he called Dad and quit, just flat quit. He said he could not find anything, and he was not going to keep looking. He refunded the entire retainer. Dad just sat there holding the phone for 10 minutes, not moving. I have never seen him like that, Elena. Never." I absorbed this information. The investigator's inability to find records was entirely expected. My background had been deliberately complicated by agencies that specialized in creating complication. There were layers of misdirection, dummy corporations, redacted personnel files, sealed court orders, and classification markers that would require the highest security clearances even to request. Most private investigators, even former FBI agents, would never have encountered that level of protective architecture. But the investigator's fear, his refusal to continue, his immediate withdrawal, was more interesting. He had probably stumbled against a classification marker, a silent, invisible wall that said, in effect, "Do not proceed. What lies beyond is not for you." People outside the intelligence world often do not understand how effectively a well-constructed dead end can communicate mortal danger. He had received that message and wisely chosen to walk away. Marcus was still talking. "I realized something, Elena. All those years, I thought you were just gone. I thought you moved away and forgot about us. I accepted Dad's version of things without ever questioning it, that you were selfish, that you abandoned the family, that you didn't care. And now I'm finding out that you paid the property taxes during the drought. You covered Mom's experimental treatment when insurance ran out. You paid for Uncle Robert's heart surgery. You funded half the irrigation repairs after the flood of '09. You kept this family afloat for 20 years while Dad was too proud to admit we needed help. And I didn't know any of it. I never even thought to ask." His voice cracked. He turned to look at me and his eyes were wet. "I am so sorry, Elena. I am so profoundly sorry. I was a child when all this started, but I have been an adult for 40 years. I should have asked. I should have called. I should have been your brother." I did not offer him easy absolution. I have learned over a long life that premature forgiveness is a subtle form of dishonesty, a way of closing a wound before it has been properly cleaned. Real reconciliation requires more than a single emotional conversation on a frozen park bench. But I also recognized the genuine pain in his voice, and I remembered that he, too, had grown up under the weight of William Brooks. His path had been different, but the father had been the same. I sat beside him on the cold bench. "You were a child, Marcus, and then you were a young man trying to survive the same impossible expectations I was fleeing. I do not blame you for not knowing. I blame the silence we were all trained to live inside. Dad trained us. He trained all of us. He made questions feel like betrayals. I could have reached out too. I did not. We both have work to do." He nodded, his jaw tight. We sat there until the cold became unbearable. Then we walked back to the inn together, and before he drove away, he hugged me. It was the first real, unguarded hug we had shared since I was 17 years old. When he pulled back, he said, "What do we do now?" I said. "We tell the truth, starting with the financial records, and then we see what grows." If you have a sibling you have grown distant from, someone you once loved and lost touch with, take a moment right now to think of them. Drop a single star in the comments if you believe reconciliation is possible, even after decades of silence. And if you are still watching and have not yet subscribed, now is the perfect moment. This story is building towards something extraordinary, and you will not want to miss the final revelations. The new judge assigned to the case was Judge Patricia Okonkwo, a trim, precise woman in her late 50s with a reputation for impartiality, efficiency, and an absolute intolerance for procedural misconduct. She reviewed the case file over a single weekend and arrived on Monday morning with a clear understanding that something had gone profoundly wrong in the original proceedings. The courthouse was packed. News of Judge Hanford's dramatic recusal, the mysterious phrase I had spoken, his physical collapse into white-faced terror, and the arrival of the enigmatic Washington observer had transformed the case into the most intensely discussed event in Ashford County since the Great Blizzard of 1967. Reporters from regional newspapers, 2 television crews from Billings, and even a correspondent from a national legal affairs blog had descended on the small town. The air inside the courtroom crackled with coiled energy. My father entered with the assistance of a cane, an accessory I had never seen him use before. He had aged a decade in 5 days. His confident stride was gone. His shoulders curved forward. His face was drawn and pale. He did not look at me as he took his seat at the plaintiff's table. Marcus stayed close to him, but I noticed that Marcus's posture had shifted. He was no longer sitting directly in our father's shadow. He was sitting slightly apart, his own man, visibly uncertain but no longer blindly obedient. Amara and I took our positions at the defendant's table. I saw Everett Cho slip into the back row, a leather notebook open on his knee, his expression one of calm, professional attention. He caught my eye for a single moment and gave a minuscule nod. I nodded back. Judge Okonkwo began by addressing the procedural irregularities of the previous hearings with a clipped, precise tone that left no room for ambiguity. She noted that Judge Hanford's recusal had included a written statement acknowledging his long-standing personal friendship with the plaintiff and his failure to maintain judicial impartiality. She then, without any argument from either side, admitted the full set of financial records that the previous judge had blocked. Amara presented them methodically. Wire transfer confirmations, property tax receipts, medical bills from my mother's treatment, emergency veterinary invoices during the hoof and mouth outbreak, irrigation repair contracts after the flood of 2009, Uncle Robert's bypass surgery hospital bills. The payments spanned 22 years and totaled, according to the final summary Amara entered into evidence, more than $940,000. Every single payment was traceable back to me, through accounts I had maintained specifically for this purpose, routed through intermediaries to protect my anonymity. The courtroom fell into a profound, almost religious silence as each document was read aloud and projected onto a screen. My father sat motionless. His attorney, Mr. Aldridge, looked increasingly pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like frost under a heat lamp. I saw Marcus bow his head and press his fingers against his temples. Behind me, I heard someone in the spectator section inhale sharply. Judge Okonkwo turned to me. Ms. Brooks, can you confirm that you made these payments voluntarily, without expectation of repayment or public recognition? I stood. Yes, Your Honor, I can. She asked, why did you make them? What was your motivation? I had spent decades preparing for a question like this, though I had never imagined it would be asked in a courtroom. The answer was simple, but its weight was enormous. Because my mother asked me to look after this family before she died. Because the land my great-grandfather homesteaded means something profound to me, even if I was not permitted to say so for most of my life. Because I could help, and helping was never about recognition or gratitude. It was about love. Love for my mother. Love for this place. Love for a family that, for all its flaws, is still my family. The word love seemed to hang in the air like a sustained musical note. I saw my father flinch, a visible physical flinch, as though the word had struck him. Judge Okonkwo nodded slowly. Then she turned to Mr. Aldridge. Counselor, the foundational premise of your client's lawsuit is that the defendant abandoned the property and contributed nothing to its maintenance or welfare. The evidence now admitted directly and comprehensively contradicts that claim. How do you wish to proceed? Mr. Aldridge asked for a recess. Judge Okonkwo granted a short one. During the recess, I walked to the courthouse steps with Amara. The winter sun had emerged from behind the clouds, casting long, pale shadows across the snow-covered street. A sizable crowd of spectators had gathered outside, unable to fit into the courtroom. They parted as I passed. I heard whispered fragments. That's her. That's the daughter. She paid for everything, apparently. What was the thing she said to the old judge? I felt neither pride nor embarrassment. I felt like a woman who had been carrying a very heavy stone for a very long time and had just begun, finally, to set it down on solid ground. When the hearing resumed, Mr. Aldridge made a surprising and, I suspect, deeply reluctant announcement. His client, William Brooks, wished to withdraw the lawsuit with prejudice and would not pursue any further legal action regarding the ownership of the Brooks Ranch. The courtroom buzzed. Judge Okonkwo looked at my father directly. Mr. Brooks, is this your wish, freely and without coercion? My father stood. The cane wobbled slightly in his grip. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse and thin, nothing like the commanding baritone I remembered from my childhood. "Yes, Your Honor, it is my wish. I want to withdraw the suit. I was wrong. I was wrong about many things." The admission, delivered in a room full of neighbors, reporters, and strangers, cost him more than any financial settlement ever could. His pride, the central pillar of his entire identity, cracked audibly in that moment. I saw his shoulders tremble. I saw Marcus reach out and steady him gently. Judge Okonkwo dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. She also issued a formal order recognizing my 45% ownership stake and mandating that it be fully reflected in all county property records. She added, in a tone that was dry but unmistakably pointed, a strong encouragement that both parties seek mediation for any future disagreements rather than resort to litigation. The gavel fell with a crisp, final sound. It was, after 5 days of chaos and a lifetime of silence, over. My father did not collapse this time. He walked out of the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps, leaning on his cane and on Marcus's arm. He did not speak to me. He did not need to. The legal war was finished. The deeper war, the old war of erasure and silence and manufactured invisibility, was only beginning to truly heal. I drove out to the ranch later that week, alone. The gravel road was treacherous with packed snow, but my rental truck handled it with patient determination. The landscape was a vast, white quiet, broken only by the dark shapes of cattle huddled near the feed stations. I parked near the old red barn, now faded to a soft rust color after decades of Montana winters. The cottonwood trees that lined the entrance were bare, their branches skeletal against the pale sky. I walked to the fence line where my mother used to sit on summer evenings, a cup of coffee in her hands, her eyes on the distant mountains. The bench she had loved was gone, replaced at some point by a newer one of pressure-treated wood, probably built by Marcus or one of his sons. I sat down anyway. The winter air was knife-sharp and clean. The mountains stood in their ancient, silent watchfulness. I felt my mother's presence so vividly it was as though she were sitting beside me, her hand on my arm, her voice soft in my ear. "I understand you perfectly." I had finally, after 62 years, claimed the place she had promised me. Not with violence, not with clever legal maneuvering, with a single, carefully chosen designation that reminded a corrupt judge the world was vastly larger and more complex than his small Montana kingdom. That evening, back at Helen's bed and breakfast, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number I associated with the ranch's main house. I answered. It was my father. His voice was tired, worn thin, but steadier than it had been in the courtroom. "I would like to talk," he said. "Not about the lawsuit. Not about the ranch, just talk, if you are willing." I said I was willing. We arranged for me to come to the house the following afternoon. I did not sleep well that night. The prospect of a real conversation with my father, after so many years of silence, felt as unnerving as any assignment I had ever undertaken. The ranch house was exactly as I remembered it. Heavy oak furniture that had belonged to my great-grandparents, mounted antlers over the stone fireplace, the faint, permanent smell of wood smoke and leather, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the same clock my mother used to wind every Sunday evening. My father was sitting in his old armchair by the fire, a wool blanket draped over his knees despite the warmth of the flames. He looked small in the large chair, diminished, as though the events of the past week had physically compressed him. He gestured for me to sit in the chair opposite. I did. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The fire hissed and popped. The clock ticked. Outside, the winter wind pressed against the windows. Finally, my father asked the question I had been waiting for, the question he had never once asked in 40 years. "What were you, Elena, all those years? What were you really doing out there?" I looked into the fire. I thought about the men and women I had worked with, the operations I could knee. Describe the lives that had been saved because someone at a desk in a windowless room noticed a pattern in a satellite image or a discrepancy in a translated document. I thought about the long nights, the isolation, the accumulated weight of secrets. I could not tell him most of it. I will never be able to tell anyone most of it, but I told him what I could. I said, "I served my country, Dad, in ways that most people never see and never hear about. I was an intelligence analyst, and then a coordinator, and then something more. I helped protect people from threats they never knew existed. I operated in places that are not on maps. I gave up having a normal life, a husband, children, a home that was truly mine, because the work I was doing required that sacrifice. I never spoke about it because I was legally prohibited from speaking about it. But I was not running away from this family. I was trying to become someone I could respect when I looked in the mirror. The fire crackled, my father stared at me. His eyes, which had always seemed so hard and certain, were wet. A tear slipped down his weathered cheek. He did not wipe it away. "I did not know," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I did not know any of that. You were just gone, and I made up a story in my head that you were rebellious, that you were ungrateful, that you thought you were too good for this place. I never asked, I never once asked. I just decided who you were and never checked to see if I was right." I nodded. "Yes, that is exactly what happened. You wrote a story about me, Dad. A story where I was the disappointment, the one who did not belong. And you never checked to see if it was true. You never asked a single question. You treated me like I was invisible because believing I was invisible was easier than admitting you might have been wrong." He closed his eyes. The tears were flowing freely now, tracking through the deep lines of his face. "I wasted so many years," he whispered. "So many years. I treated you like an enemy. I treated your mother's love for you like a betrayal. I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong about everything." We sat in silence for a while. I did not offer him a grand, cinematic forgiveness. I am not built that way. The wounds of 40 years do not heal in a single fireside conversation, no matter how tearful. But I thought about my mother. I thought about what she would have wanted. I stood up, walked over to his chair, and gently adjusted the blanket that had slipped from his bony knees. Then I said, "I am here now, Dad. After everything, I am still here. That is a start." He reached up with a trembling hand and took mine. His grip was weak, far weaker than I remembered, but it was real. We sat like that, father and daughter, in the quiet old house, while the fire burned low and the Montana night gathered thick and cold outside the windows. It was not a perfect ending. Perfect endings do not exist between people who have spent decades wounding each other. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, I have learned, are often enough. In the months that followed the dismissal, I chose not to sell my share. Many people advised it. Amara, who had become a friend as well as a lawyer, suggested that liquidating my stake and walking away might be the cleanest path forward. A younger version of me, the version who fled Montana at 18 with nothing but a scholarship and a desperate hunger to be elsewhere, might have done exactly that. But I was no longer that young woman. I was 62 years old, and I had spent a lifetime learning that running is not the same as moving forward. My mother had given me 45% of the Brooks ranch, not because she wanted me to cash a check, but because she wanted me to belong. And belonging, I realized, required showing up. So I proposed a new arrangement. With the help of a skilled mediator, we created the Clara Brooks Conservation Trust, named after my mother, the quiet woman whose fierce love had held our fractured family together for as long as she lived. The trust protected the ranch from any future development. It preserved the wildlife habitat, the water rights, the grazing lands, and the family cemetery where my mother was buried beneath a simple headstone carved with her name and a single line of poetry. It gave Marcus's children and their children a permanent stake in the land, ensuring they could keep working it for generations. And it gave me something I had never fully possessed, a recognized, permanent, unassailable place in the story of the Brooks Ranch. My father, still recovering his strength, and I think, still processing the collapse of his lifelong narrative, agreed to the trust without argument. He even came to the mediator's office and signed the documents with a steady hand. It was, Marcus later told me, the first time our father had ever voluntarily deferred to someone else's vision for the ranch's future. "He's different now," Marcus said. Quieter, softer. It's like watching a mountain slowly erode. I bought a small house in Ashford, not on the ranch itself, but close enough to visit easily. I still consulted occasionally, still maintained my security clearances, still lived with one foot in the quiet world I had inhabited for so long. But I also began spending real time in Montana. I attended the Ashford County Fair for the first time in 44 years. I had coffee at the diner with Helen Whitfield, who had become a close friend. I walked the ranch's pastures with Marcus, listening to him talk about herd management and water tables and the challenges of the modern cattle market. I told him stories about our mother, stories he had either forgotten or never heard. He told me about his children, my niece and nephew, two bright, curious young adults who had grown up hearing almost nothing about their mysterious aunt. I met them. I gave them books. I answered their questions. I saw in them the same hunger for knowledge that had driven me at their age. And I made a private vow, in my mother's memory, to do for them what she had done for me, to see them, to encourage them, and to never let anyone make them feel invisible. One evening in late spring, almost a year after the lawsuit ended, my father asked me to come to the ranch. The cottonwoods were just beginning to leaf out, their new growth a pale, tender green. The mountains were purple with evening light. I found him sitting on the porch, a light blanket across his knees, watching the sun descend behind the Ipsarokas. I sat in the chair beside him. We did not speak for a while. The silence was no longer hostile. It was comfortable. Eventually, he turned to me and said, "Your mother told me once, a long time ago, that you were going to be the most extraordinary person this family ever produced." I laughed at her. I thought she was being sentimental and foolish. She was not. She saw you, Elena. She saw you long before I ever did. I felt a tightness in my throat. She saw you too, Dad. She loved you. Despite everything, she loved you. He nodded slowly. She was a far better person than I ever was. I said she would want us to move forward, not to forget. She would not want us to pretend the past did not happen, but she would want us to move forward. He reached over and patted my hand with his thin, papery fingers. "Forward, then," he said. "Forward together." The Clara Brooks Conservation Trust still exists today. It protects over 28,000 acres of prime Montana rangeland. Marcus's children sit on the board. I visit several times a year, staying in the small house I bought, spending mornings walking the pastures and afternoons reading in the quiet of my living room. The ranch is no longer a battleground. It is a home, imperfect, complicated, still carrying the scars of its history, but a home nonetheless. The past has not been erased. You cannot erase 40 years of silence, but it has been integrated into a larger story, a story of survival, of quiet resilience, and of a daughter who finally, after a lifetime of being overlooked, spoke 3 words that unmade an empire of lies. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of someone in your own life, a parent you never fully understood, a child you underestimated, a sibling you have not spoken to in years, a silence that has stretched on for too long, I want you to do something right now. Pause this video. Pick up your phone, send a message, make a call, write a letter, bridge a gap. It does not have to be perfect. It does not have to solve everything. It just has to be a beginning. You never know how much time is left, and you never know what someone has been carrying in silence all these years. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to this story. If you believe, as I do, that the quietest voices often carry the deepest strength, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about ordinary people who discover, sometimes very late, that they are anything but ordinary. Until next time, remember, you are seen, you matter. And your story, no matter how much of it has already been written, is still being written every single day.